tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we've been talking about right or wise view, samanditi, the first link of the Noble Eightfold Path, and how right or wise view is expressed in a number of ways in the texts. The two very traditional ways we've looked at so far in the last few weeks, right view expressed as the practice of inquiry based in the Four Noble Truths, and right view as a practice of inquiry based in the teaching of Kamma, or karma, action that carries force in the world, action that has impact, action that arises out of intention, volition, and which conditions the future. So the basic equation of Kamma is that conscious beings receiving the conditions around them, which is the momentum from the past, right? Receiving these conditions, we have experiences. Based in those experiences, we either act unconsciously out of habit, pattern, nervous system, trauma, cultural conditioning, or we act consciously with volition and or more agency. It's actually volition in both cases. Acting unconsciously, it's still volitional. It still creates karma. It tends to create poor karma. But we act either, unconsciously or consciously, and when we are conscious, we have the opportunity to act intentionally for the good. And so all of our actions have a tiny spark of volition behind them. And many of them, our ordinary actions, are relatively neutral. And so they don't create a huge ripple in the field. They don't affect our lives, for good or for ill in a dramatic way. But those actions that we do that are strongly charged, and the charge is really ethical, do they cause harm or do they help? Those actions create a strong ripple in the field. And the ripple really just means that they have an impact on others and they have an impact on ourselves. And we talked last week about Kamma as the kind of internal corollary to the external disciplines of sīla, ethical action, and dāna, generosity or giving. So from the intention to serve others and care for others, we act in service of their well-being. This is wholesome, it generates good kamma, it's beautiful, it creates good relationships. But the good kamma that it creates is not traditionally centered on its impacts on others. The impact on others is how we express our generosity or our compassion or our wise action. But the kamma, the result that it creates, is most importantly for our own well-being, for ourselves. So if I act to cause harm and it causes harm for someone else, if I act unskillfully and it causes harm for someone else, I carry the momentum of that action. That's kamma. So kamma is the internal residue, as it were, or momentum of my own actions. And traditionally, this is most important in relation to rebirth. It conditions the kind of rebirth I have after this life. And rebirth is important because if I'm human and hearing these teachings, then, almost no matter how dire my situation gets, if I can find some soundness of mind and good intention in my heart, I can heal or recover from quite a lot. People are very resilient, and I can turn my life toward goodness. So the human birth, having this human life that each of us listening here has, those of us that are human, there may well be the spirits around listening, blessings to you. You too have the good karma of being in a form that can hear and understand the Dhamma. That those of us who can practice always have the possibility of turning our life around by doing actions based in wholesome intention and then receiving the benefit of that. The reason that rebirth is so important is that our actions condition our next birth, which may not be human. And if our action is particularly one that's either deeply deluded or actively harmful, really causes a painful impact in the world, that subsequent birth might be human, but in a very dire circumstance where I can't practice the Dhamma, or it might be in a life form that doesn't have the kind of heart and mind that can be mindful, generate intentions that are separate from habitual action. I might be reborn as a kind of animal that's less capable of practicing the Dhamma, or a spirit being who's in a very dire state. I might be born immersed in the energies of grasping or hatred or delusion that color the world. And so the human birth is considered ideal for practice. And one of the traditional imperatives in practice is to sculpt our actions such that at the very least, we're not reborn in dire circumstances in a subsequent birth. You may or may not take the teachings on rebirth literally, and so you can think of them psychologically and it works well, right? And you can even ignore the future birth, but just think about the rest of this human birth and say, you can see in others, and you might know in particularly difficult seasons in your own life, what it's like to bear the wound of your own harmful earlier actions, right? I've had seasons in my life where I'm not really taking care of myself well. I'm not being very generous to others. I'm lost in states of wanting or frustration or grumpiness or hatred of kinds or delusion. And it just drags my life down. And I know what that's like. And knowing what that's like, that is the karmic impact of my own actions. If I've lost my discipline, if I've lost my sense of wholesomeness, if I've lost my purpose, and I've started to fall into actions that are toxic in various ways, I will feel that impact and it will drag me down. And, addictions of many kinds are like this. And so if we can recover from that, what Kamma describes is the process by which wholesome action, repeated again and again, and maintaining disciplines of ethics, but also self-care and compassion and care for others, that it creates a future for myself of more wholesome mind states. Right? This is really the basis of practices that are not Buddhist at all, but have, a thread of basis in the ancient traditions, practices like, what gets called manifestation, or new thought, which is really a Christian Protestant idea from the mid-19th century. So if you like The Secret and you like manifesting, you're doing a Protestant Christian thing from the Civil War era, from the prosperity gospel is what it was called. But the idea is that if you think it, you can make it come to be. They didn't get Kamma entirely wrong. And the way that they got it right is that, in the way that the Buddha would say, that which you repeatedly think and dwell on, that becomes the nature of your mind. It doesn't automatically become the nature of the external world. So you can constantly dwell on becoming rich and not become rich. So manifestation doesn't work that way. But you could constantly dwell on achieving financial security and use that as motivation to work very hard and get educated and corral whatever resources you have. And you might have a better chance, you would have then a better chance of becoming financially secure than if you, didn't have purpose and lulled around not working on it. So to that extent, it's true. So Kamma is the individual expression of the momentum of our actions. And it's the way that our actions bear fruit in our own life and future lives. So the traditional model of Kamma is individual. And it's individual because it's so linked to our intentions and to volitional action. Right? It's not about things that just happen around me, kind of accidentally, or that I'm sort of swept up in being a part of. It's really about the choices that I make impacting my heart and mind state going forward. But if that's the shape of Kamma, if that's how Kamma works, then what can we say about the actions of larger groups of people? And this becomes what gets called collective Kamma. And so I wrote a bit about this today in the newsletter and in a post, and immediately one of my dear Dhamma friends, Sangha member, wrote in, as they do sometimes when I say something contentious, and they said, essentially like, I love you, but isn't that theory incorrect in a traditional Theravadan sense? And so it is. And the objection to it is based on this aspect of Kamma as being individual, that because it's dependent on volition and because you can't act on behalf of someone else, like I can't liberate your heart by doing good action myself. You have to actually do it yourself. People would ask the Buddha, you're so powerful, can you liberate people, like magically? And he would say, I can't do it. I can show you, I can tell you directions. He said it this way at one point. He said somebody asked him, can't you liberate others? And he said, tell me where you live. And they said, oh, I live by a crossroads, kind of halfway between, they didn't say exactly these towns, but I'll say them, halfway between, Varanasi and Gaya. He said, great. If someone comes to you and says, I want to get to Varanasi, which way do I go? What do you do? And the person who lives at the crossroads said, oh, I point them down that road, the road, west. I say, go that way. That's the road to Varanasi, and you'll get there if you follow that road. And the Buddha says, and what happens if they hear that advice and then they take a different road? And the man says, well, they wouldn't get to Varanasi. And the Buddha says, just so, I give really good directions. It's up to you to follow them. So you can't liberate someone else. And because of this, Kamma is, in a fundamental way, individual. Everyone, and it's important that it is. Everyone has their own choices. Everyone has agency. Everyone has a kind of power to act not as part of a collective, but really, on your own. And this is important because in so many cultures, you are, as the texts say, going against the stream. You have to actually go against the stream to act ethically and cultivate love in as radical a way as the Dhamma encourages us to do, when the world around you is manifesting greed, hatred, and delusion all the time. You go against that stream, and sometimes you have to go it alone if you don't have a strong Sangha around you. So Kamma is individual. Yes. And there's no mention of collective Kamma in the early texts. So that's true. So what do we mean when we use this word collective Kamma? And I do use it. Here's how I think about it. Groups of people can, first of all, have a kind of collective identity. And I think of collective identities as appearing in a certain way like nested rings, like nested dolls. So individuals can be part of a collective related by blood or other or marriage or adoption or other close connections that we call family. So a family is a collective, and many families, not all but many, manifest a kind of identity, a kind of self. right? So there's the family is an entity, and maybe it's an entity across time. If I say, if you say like, oh yeah, I'm a part of an old established family, in a certain way, we're all part of an old established family because everyone has ancestors going way back. But you might identify with that. That might be part of your identity. Or you could say the family holds a kind of identity, you know. And so a family uh, can, of course, have traumas. A family can have feelings. A family can have habits and patterns and all these things that we might call a personality, right? If I said to you, like, what's the personality of your family? Not the personality of any one individual, but the collective personality of the family, you could probably say what it is. Right? So a family can have a kind of identity. A larger collection, an extra-familial group, can have a kind of identity. Here you might think of cultural groups that are aligned on the basis of some quality. So, a community of queer folks in a certain area, or a political party, or an ethnic community in diaspora where there's a strong sense of localized identity or collective identity. Any of these kinds of groups can also have, a personality, a feeling, right? Someone who's really familiar with, let's say, you know, gay male culture in San Francisco might say, oh yeah, gay culture in the Castro has a certain personality. Gay culture, across town in Polk Street in the Tenderloin, there's also a strong community there, has a different personality. Different communities, different personality, and you might even have a sense of like, this community has different patterns of action, patterns of speech, different feelings that they manifest, you know? And then you might go and visit, the gay community up in Vancouver or in Paris or Tel Aviv or Shanghai and say, oh, these, you know, uh, some qualities are shared and some are very different, right? It's a different kind of entity. So a community at that level has a certain personality, right? And certainly, nowadays, big communities like a political party, which might be quite homogenous, but often is, full of lots of sub-communities and it's built up by allyship and it's a kind of coalition. It can still have a kind of personality. Right? And of course, the nation state is a kind of entity, right? It's a kind of person. And it's a collective. It's often not a unified collective, but it has some of the qualities of an entity. It can have a personality, it can have communication styles, it certainly has language often, or languages that are associated with it in specific ways. And so all of these levels, from the individual to family to community groups to large, like nation state kinds of cultures, all the way out to what we might call, species identity, can be thought of. I want to encourage us to experiment with thinking of any of these levels as a singular entity. You can think of what is the entity of the United States? What is the entity of, the East Bay Puerto Rican community, right? Whatever frame you put around it, think about it as a kind of conditioned aggregate self. And Buddhism is actually really good at thinking about, unstable, unfixed aggregates of conditions as being a kind of self. Because what are we? That's the whole teaching on anatta, on selflessness, is that this thing that I call myself is a collection of these aggregates. There's form, there's feelings, there's perceptions, there's formations, there's consciousness. They're all empty of essence, empty of intrinsic nature. They're empty of permanence, right? They're a coming together of conditions that fluctuates based on changing conditions and then dissipates. And so my riposte to the folks that say Kamma is individual and therefore there can't be collective Kamma is to say that there's no such thing as an individual, actually, or that an individual is just a contingent fluctuating framework the same way that a community is. Right? And so, footnote here, internal family systems, for an actual therapeutic approach that takes this seriously and understands that you can very productively relate to your internal life as a collection of parts that sometimes agree and sometimes disagree and have arguments and, might be democratic or anarchic or authoritarian, at various times. And they're a kind of family or a kind of community. Sometimes in meditation, we'll say, check in with your inner boardroom and see if you can notice which part is always the dominant leader and which part is sitting quietly in the corner, unafraid to speak, and which part is so excluded they're not even in the meeting, etc. So if the individual is a kind of collective, the collective can be a kind of individual. And so if kamma or karma is the momentum of actions that are charged with ethical force that comes through a volitional choice-making system, in other words, an entity, a person, you, me, a community, a nation, in whatever way we can understand a collective as manifesting a kind of collective volition, then that collective will bear the kamma of what its choices lead to. Maybe the early tradition didn't think about collective kamma, didn't have an active theory about collective kamma because it wasn't a democracy, right? Maybe it didn't have the sense that a whole bunch of disparate people could, in the aggregate, make a choice. And so how might we, as folks raised into these complex postmodern democracies, think about what it means for a large group of people all together to make a choice, and then all together to bear the result of that choice? Collective kamma points to the way that individuals are not to blame for the kamma of their families, communities, nations, species. Individuals have a part to play, but can never hold the kamma of a level that's outside their own. So an individual bears the fruit of the kamma of their family, but doesn't hold it alone and can't heal it alone. You can, in a certain way, heal your relationship to your family, but some aspects of that might, for instance, not be able to be healed in interaction with the family. And so you have to hold that alone. In essence, you take your individual part out of the family kamma and you hold it yourself because it can't be healed in the family system. But properly speaking, family kamma belongs to the family. And an individual healing from it won't change the family kamma unless they engage back with the family in some way. Likewise, as an individual, you can abstain in various ways from the kammic momentum of your nation. And we do this by resisting, we do this by protesting, we do this by, making our voice heard, by trying to shift actually the system. That's kind of like engagement to try to shift it. You can also really abstain, like you could leave or you can become a monastic or just retire from engagement. But you can't actually fully step out because you're a member of the collective. There's no way to actually leave a collective fully that you've been a part of, right? Your action, even the action of stepping back, creates a kind of karmic ripple. And so part of why I think this is helpful is that it gives us a way to, first of all, to understand how nations, for instance, I'll keep going with nation because they make some of the most painful choices. How nations, first of all, can be born, change based in conditions, and die. Empires are born and die. Nation states are born at certain times and can die. I know astrologers who, who will run the natal chart of a country, like who'll run the natal chart of the United States based on the 4th of July, 1776, when it's born as an independent nation. And then they will say, oh, this year is going to be a difficult year or a good year or whatever for the nation. You know, other nations don't have a founding date that's as easy to run astrology on, but um, there's um, there's this way that we can see that a nation as a collective has a kind of volition that maybe very few individuals in the nation actually support, and no one supports entirely, right? How many people in this country right now actually support the deportation regime that ICE is manifesting? You know, so few, actually. But the collective Kamma has led to this moment. And that collective Kamma is not just the sum of everybody's vote, but it's actually the sum of all the momentum of all these years of collective struggle around, being around immigration and race and otherness and whiteness and power and capitalism, all coming together into this moment where we are on the edge of a xenophobic authoritarian state. And so how do we relate to being part of that and part of a, a, a fragile democracy connected to these things that are happening? Understanding that the collective has a kind of Kamma that's unfolding lawfully through time, I think can be a way to frame what's happening differently in our minds and in a way that's less, that we can be less individually identified with and more understand that we are part of these large sweeps of historical force. And maybe that can clarify for us how to participate in them in a way that has less anxiety, in them. Likewise, you know, uh, the other day, yesterday, there was one of the most massive protests in Tel Aviv of folks in Israel begging their government to stop the war and to stop the genocide of the Palestinian people. And so many, folks in the American Jewish community and worldwide Jewish communities have felt their connection to the national Kamma of Israel and the process that led to this war and this horror, and have been wrestling so deeply with their relationship to it, and those of us that are not Jewish wrestling with our relationship to it and to our Jewish friends and to our nation and to the system globally that we can see that has led to this. And you can see this process of trying to figure out what do we do about the collective Kamma. You can see it in the way that some of the conversations become so painful. Conversations where someone might say, this is unconscionable what Israel is doing in Gaza, and a question might come back, do you support Israel's right to exist as a nation? Which in a certain way, you know, is an impossible gotcha question in the post-colonial world, but it's also a way to say that we understand that this moment is absolutely connected to this long series of small conflicts contained in the large uh, arc of the Zionist movement and the founding of Israel, in the early 20th century, and all of the forces that led to that, which is inextricably connected to the long relationship, sometimes warm, sometimes very cold, between, European Jewish folks and imperial Christianity for thousands of years. Collective Kamma understands that no individual person holds that historical force, but that whole collectives of people bear the result. And so I think where I want us to reflect with this is to feel into the ways that we as individuals participate in many layers of collective identity. I'm an individual which means I identify with this body and its sensory experiences and its cognitive and emotional experiences as a kind of aggregate self. And I understand that it's conditioned and fluctuating and empty of essence. You know, at least hypothetically, I understand that. On a good day, I feel it. You know, and it manifests as wisdom. Other days I'm confused and I really hunker down. You know how it is. But this body I recognize is also part of a family, or in my case, a couple families, um, with adoption, various streams. But I'm part of a family of blood and 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 other connections, and I can feel the self of that family. And so, as an inquiry, I can feel myself as an individual, and then I could open to feel the family, and I can feel not just how I relate to the family, but I can feel that the family has a kind of identity in the world that manifests through me and my siblings and my other, you know, relatives that are alive and past as ancestors, my child. And then I can go out and I can feel communities that I'm a part of, you know. I can feel my refuge in Sangha and feel my connection to Buddhist community. And this way that when we go to Thailand or Burma or India, I've been in this religion, this tradition for long enough that when I walk into a Buddhist temple anywhere in the world, um, something in my heart feels more at ease. I feel like uh, I feel like I know how to be there, and so I belong in a community, in the community of the Sangha. And so when I tune into that, I can feel the Kamma, the momentum of the Sangha in the world. You know, and so recently, this past month, when there was a border conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, it wasn't just interesting or sad that these two countries are fighting, but I felt a connection to it as two ancient Buddhist, Theravadan Buddhist countries being in conflict. When there was a scandal in Thailand with a monk this past month, it had a particular ouch for me, in a way that scandals in the Southern Baptist Convention don't sting in the same way. I'm not part of that community, you know, but I really felt it when it was a corrupt Buddhist monk, you know. The unwholesome, you know, the misconduct and genocidal action of the Burmese government against the Rohingya people in Burma or Myanmar, I really felt as a painful Kamma being perpetrated collectively by this venerable Buddhist country where I trained and did my monastic time. So I have so much love, you know, for that place. So in all of these ways, and of course I feel myself, you know, as an American, and um, and I want to encourage us to feel how the Kamma, for instance, of our nation, and some of us are more recent immigrants to this nation or have membership in multiple nationalities in our collective Kamma, to encourage us to feel not just how we as an individual are in relationship to the collective of our nation or community or whatever, but how we can feel that energy manifesting through us. That I spend so much time being in a kind of resistance to being American. And sometimes I take refuge in being Californian because I like it better. I'm very happy I live here, you know, for values, etc. But to actually get real with how, you know, I carry through my being and through my family and communities, which are all embedded here in what's currently called the United States, um, how the Kamma of this nation is here uh, impacting me. I carry it, and it's part of my birth and my rebirth, and our birth and rebirth as a nation. And so we carry the Kamma of slavery. We carry the Kamma of the indigenous genocide. We carry the Kamma of, you know, being one of the most brilliant and stable democracies in the world. And so the Kamma of the Enlightenment and the rational, democratic vision of this place, the Kamma of being an immigrant welcoming country, even as we are a colonial power, and the complexity of that. Can we actually feel and carry the force that pours through us as members of these various nested collectives, and use that to understand how our participation in these various circles can be inhabited, again, with less anxiety, with less distress, with less confusion, actually, about who we are and what our purpose is here as a participant in these interwoven, nested selves that are our world, even our entire species. So pausing there.